Hi, Dahi. I miss you.
Hey, Nehemiah, Dahi, I hope both of you are doing well. Nehemiah's your cousin, so don't forget to say hi to her.
Hi, Nehemiah.
Alright, I figured we've read a couple of short books and some semi-long ones, but I wanted to read something with some historical value. We are going to start the adventures of the Tales of King Arthur. Now, this version, The Tales of King Arthur, written by James Riordan, illustrated by Victor Ambrose. Now, there's quite a bit to this book. That being said, I'm going to go through and record a couple of different chapters, one or two each time. That way we'll eventually have the entire thing done. Alright, we're going to be starting off with The Coming of Arthur. Now, there's not a whole lot of pictures in this book, but what pictures are done are actually very beautiful, very colorful, well illustrated. So,
And this ain't a real baby. Everyone keep thinking it's a real baby. Dad!
Not a baby. It looks like it, but it's a baby doll. Not the baby, not the baby. See, somebody's missing you so much that they've all had to have their baby dolls. Well, let us get started with The Coming of King Arthur. Many years ago, the land we now call the British Isles were known as Logres. When the Romans came in the 1st century AD, they named the island Britain after a tribe that lived there. Having conquered the whole of Britain, the Romans built towns and roads and brought law and order to their Christian religion to the many warring tribes. For 100 years went by. During this time, Britain prospered. Rome, meanwhile, grew weak and by AD 410 had to withdraw the last of its legions from its British colony. No sooner had the Roman soldiers gone than raiders from the coast of Europe became more and more daring. They crossed the seas from Denmark and Germany, burned and robbed the villages of eastern and southern Britain, made Britons slaves, and occupied the land. Troubled times returned. Though many British chieftains fought the invaders gallantly, others struck bargains with them to divide up the land. Once more the country was split into many scattered feuding tribes, and the suffering people spoke with sadness of the days when Britain had been united. They longed for a strong king who would bring back peace and justice. At last, a chieftain, one Constantine Pendragon, succeeded in setting up a small haven of calm and order in the southeast corner of the island. Constantine had two sons, Constance and Uther. Soon after their birth, the king died, and at once a Welsh chieftain named Vortigern had the first boy murdered and himself declared king. Constantine's widow had to flee across the sea to France to save herself and Uther. Vortigern then invited the Saxons and Danes to settle in Britain and help him fight the Scots and the Picts. So, a little bit of brief background. The Saxons and Danes are what is commonly called Vikings. And this is more of a not quite fully historical, but pretty close in referencing the story of King Arthur. It is these stories that have been passed down. So there is some very strong historical context in these books. So for example, there really was a chieftain called Constantine Pendragon. Now this book was originally written, well, not the original stories of King Arthur, obviously, but this book was first published in 1982. So, at that time you'll hear terms like AD, which refers to after death, which is the time frame that we use, or that used to be used, but referencing BC, which was before Christ, and then AD, after death. So historians, there was that gap. What about the entire time Jesus lived? How did they date that? So historians changed the to BCE and CE. CE stands for Common Era. So BCE instead of BC, which was before Christ, BCE is before Common Era. That's why the dates in this one is a little bit different than what you're used to in your history lessons.
So did Arthur won by with the king, or did they all fight?
Well, shall we find out?
Yeah.
Don't want to spoil the story.
Well, I
'Cause
haven't
this is-
read this.
I know you haven't read this version. You know the story of King Arthur about the Lady in the Lake, Excalibur, and stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is a kind of a historical book. See, on the back it says, every child should have the opportunity to read about the wonderful adventures of King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table. This beautiful book includes the following tales: the coming of King Arthur, Excalibur, the Round Table, the quest of the White Hart, Balin and Balan, Tristram and Isidore, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Sir Launcelot of the Lake, the adventures of Sir Galahad, the quest for the Holy Grail, Launcelot and Guinevere, and the death of King Arthur.
So was his name King Arthur?
Well, if you notice, it's actually Uther. But because of translations and stuff, it slowly became Arthur. So, Constantine's widow had to flee across the sea to France to save herself and Uther. Vortiger then invited the Saxons, Danes, to settle in Britain and help him fight the Scots and the Picts. The land knew no sleep. With each year, more and more invaders left their rocky lands and came across the North Sea in their longships to kill and drive out Britons and settle in their homes. It was then that Uther, now a strong young man, returned to Britain with an army, landing at Titanus in Devon. He besieged Vortiger in his castle near the river of Wye. Filling the dry moat around Vortiger's castle with brushwood and logs, Uther's men set fire to the wood and burned down the castle with Vortiger in it. That done, they pursued the Saxons and defeated them in many battles, bringing peace and unity to the southern lands. In the passing of time, Uther became a great and noble king, the Pendragon of all of Britain. In this, he was greatly aided by his counselor, Merlin the Wise, without whom he could never have overcome his foes. After Uther Pendragon had ruled for several years, he married a Cornish gentlewoman called Igraine. She was the widow of the Duke of Tintagel, and she already had 3 daughters: Morgause, who married King Lot of Orkney; Elaine, who married King Nantres of Garlot; and Morgana le Fay, who married King Uranus of Gore. Yes.
Nine.
You recognize Morgana le Fay?
Yeah.
A son was soon born to Uther and Igraine. Yet instead of crowning their love with joy, the innocent baby brought great pain, for just after its birth, Merlin came to the king. "Lord, as you know," Merlin said, "I can foresee what is to come. What I behold now fills my heart with grief. But what is to be will be. Very soon you will fall sick and die of a fever. Then your young son, the hope of all true Britons, will be in mortal danger, since many foes will want to kill him. There is, however, a chance that he can be saved. Let me take the boy to a secure refuge where he can remain until he grows to manhood. Hmm. It's been so long since I've read this in the original story. Maybe Uther is actually Arthur's father. I know, that's the thing with the retelling of stories. So many times the details get mixed up.
And we can't tell the name if it's Arthur or Uther.
Yeah. So, the good and brave King Uther did not flinch. If my time has come to die, he said calmly, so be it. My fate differs not from that of any other born to woman. As for my son, I would not wish him to perish too. He is the most precious gift that I bequeath my people. Take him into safety. Thus, one night, Merlin carried the baby away by a secret path down the cliff beyond the castle wall, so that no one knew where the child had been taken, and he delivered him into the care of an honest knight, Sir Hector, who adopted the baby as his own and had him baptized as Arthur. So the baby was Arthur, who later becomes King Arthur. I'm not sure. I picked this book up a while ago and only read it once, and that was shortly after I picked it up. So let's just continue to read and find out, shall we? Soon after, Uther Pendragon fell into a fever from which he did not recover, and when he died, it was exactly as Merlin had foretold. The land fell upon times more troubled than any that had gone before. King Uther's knights and barons fought amongst themselves, and the Saxons, seeing the Britons had no strong king, came and conquered more and more of the grieving land. Some 18 years of misery went by, until one day Merlin the Wise appeared out of the deep mysterious valleys of North Wales, which was then called Gwynedd. So he journeyed through the troubled countryside and arrived in London. So great was his reputation that no man dared to stop him. Merlin had come with a message for the Archbishop of Canterbury. This land is soon to have a king who will be wiser and nobler even than Uther Pendragon, said Merlin. He will bring peace and order where now there is war and strife. And this king will be of Uther's flesh and blood. I bid you summon an assembly of knights at your cathedral on Christmas Day, and they will learn who is to be the rightful king. Though puzzled by Merlin's words, the Archbishop called the Knights of the Realm to a Christmas service at his cathedral, and when the festive day dawned and the service was underway, there arose a great commotion from the churchyard. When the knights left the cathedral, they found upon the ground a marble rock, and set deep within it a glittering sword buried almost to the hilt. The knights all crowded round. None had ever seen the likes of this wonderful sword. It shone with a blinding light, and its golden hilt was inlaid with precious gems that gleamed and glittered in sunlight. And there were words written around the base of the rock. Whoever pulls this sword out of this stone is the rightful king of Britain. On the page shows the sword in the stone, which is a very famous part of the story, isn't it? What do you remember about the sword in the stone? Nothing? That's fine. Let us continue.
All I remember, no one could almost pull it out besides one person.
So, many a men there tried to pull the sword, but none could even move it. Thereupon, on Merlin's advice, the Archbishop sent messengers throughout the land to let the people know what was written on the stone, so that they could come to London to try their hand. A great tournament was announced for New Year's Day. It was then, Merlin said, that the new king would reveal himself. Thus, on the appointed day, a host of knights came to London from all corners of the country. They pitched their tents, tried their hand on the gleaming sword, and then, disappointed, sought to forget their woes in jousting.
Is that at the Ren Fair?
Not quite. It's a concept that the Ren Fair is based on, which is a big gathering at a giant festival.
Are we talking to Dickie?
Yes, we are.
Hey, baby. I'm usually with you when these are being made, so I love you. I care about you so deeply. I can't wait to hold you again. I love you. You have a lot of people wanting to meet you.
You want to say something to your brother, little one?
I love you, Daddy. You get better.
Lucas? You want to sit here and listen to the story?
Nope. I'm out.
Okay. So jousting. Jousting is where knights are on horseback and they have those long lances and they fight each other, remember?
Yeah.
They try to knock each other off. You've seen it at the Renaissance Fair.
Yeah, at the Wichita.
But, yeah, so back then, knights would gather and during big festivals they would have tournaments to try to prove who's the better and strongest knight in the realm. Usually gaining favors from the king or nobility. And sometimes they even found their lady love.
Ew, Daddy, do you love me?
Absolutely.
I love you too.
Don't do what Mommy do.
So, among the knights that came to London was Sir Hector with his son, Sir Kay, and his adopted son, Arthur, now a young man of 18 years. As the three were riding to the jousts, Sir Kay suddenly realized that he'd left his sword behind in their lodgings. He therefore asked Arthur to ride back for it. Without a word, young Arthur turned about to fetch his brother's sword, but to his dismay found the lodgings locked and no one home. "Whatever am I to do?" thought Arthur. "My brother must have a sword on this great day. I have to find him one." As he was riding back towards the tournament, Arthur chanced to pass the churchyard where the great marble rock still stood. Arthur had paid little attention to the stories about the sword. He was only interested in competing in his first great tournament. Seeing it now buried deep within the stone, he quickly dismounted, tied up his horse, and strode over to it. Taking a hold of the sword hilt, he pulled it out with barely an effort, too much in a hurry to read the words. Then he remounted his horse and shortly overtook Sir Kay, handing him the gleaming sword.
Wait, did Arthur
Yes.
pull out the sword?
Yes. As soon as Sir Kay set his eyes on the sword, he recognized it as the sword in the stone and shouted to his father, "Sire, see here is the sword from the stone. I am the rightful king of Britain." But Sir Hector, being doubtful and puzzled, rode back with his son to the cathedral and asked him to swear on the Holy Bible that he had pulled out the sword himself.
So he was trying to make it like he pulled out?
Yes. So he had to swear on the Bible. Thereupon Sir Kay confessed. "But how did you come by the sword?" asked Sir Hector, turning to the bewildered Arthur, who duly explained. Excuse me. Doing voices hurt my throat sometimes. Still uncertain, Sir Hector led Arthur to the stone so that he could read the fateful words for himself.
Oh, okay.
"Now, put the sword back in the stone and draw it out again," Sir Hector said. "That's easily done," said Arthur, sliding the sword into the stone. But before he could pull it out, his brother pushed him aside, grasped the sword hilt, and pulled with all of his might. But the sword would not move. Sir Hector also tried, without success. "Now, you try," he said to Arthur. The lad drew it out with no effort. At that, both Sir Hector and Sir Kay knelt before young Arthur and bowed down their heads. Arthur begged them to rise. "My own dear father and brother," he cried, "get up, I beg of you. It is unbecoming for a father to bow before his son." "Alas, Arthur," said Sir Hector, "though I love you as my own dear son, I must now tell you that I am not your father." And he told the story of Arthur's birth. Poor Arthur was very confused, and not a little sad, for he dearly loved the kind knight. Sir Hector at once took him to the archbishop, and the story was repeated. All the knights and barons were called together, and each one tried once more to draw out the sword, but no one succeeded. And then Arthur stepped forward to try. The sword shone brightly as he held it high in his strong right hand.
So the king won't believe he pulled out the sword?
Well, remember, at the time there was no king because the king died, right? And so all of the barons, all the nobles were fighting each other to try to become king.
Then who's that?
Those are different knights and noblemen. That is more than likely supposed to be the archbishop. And that is Arthur holding the sword in the stone.
Because I see him on the back right there fighting.
Well, I don't know. Okay. There were many men who were filled with envy. They refused to be governed by a boy who, as they thought, was of no high family. So another festive day was set for all the knights to try their fortune with the sword. First Candlemas, then Easter, and then Pentecost, or White Sun as we call it now. And on each festival, though many set hands upon the sword, none could pull it out to save for Arthur. Finally, at Whitsuntide, the common folk grew impatient with the jealous knights and clamored loudly, "We will have Arthur as our king! Long live King Arthur!" Seeing that the people would have no other king, and having seen evidence of the boy's courage and integrity over the last months, many of the knights knelt before Arthur and asked to be forgiven for their doubts. Arthur readily forgave them, took the sword in both hands, and presented it to the archbishop, who at once dubbed him knight and king. The mighty sword was then laid to rest upon the holy altar. "I swear to you, to lord and commoner," King Arthur proclaimed, "that I will serve you truly and defend justice and truth for as long as I shall live." When the coronation was over, King Arthur set about bringing peace and order to the counties about London, as far down as the southern shore and as far north as the river Trent, making his capital at Camelot in Wessex. But not all the knights bowed before him. Some resented this unknown lad who called himself the rightful king of Britain. "Why should we be ruled by a beardless boy?" they said. So it happened one time soon after that. While Arthur was at a fortress in the city of Corleone in South Wales, he was suddenly besieged by a great army led by 11 kings. Among them were King Lot of Lothian, King Indris of Cornwall, King Clarus of Northumberland, and King Agwisance of Ireland. King Owens of Gore was there with 400 knights, King Cardos of Scotland with 500, and King Nantris of Garlat with 700 men. Although this great host surrounded King Arthur's fortress, they could not break down the defense, and after 15 days Merlin appeared on the ramparts. He addressed the hostile kings, telling them the story of Arthur's birth and youth, of Sir Hector's guardianship, of the sword and the stone, and much besides, saying finally, Arthur is the rightful king of all Britain. He will save our realm from the marauding Danes and Saxons. He will punish the raiders who have ravished our lands for so many years. He will be the greatest ruler this land will ever know. Kneel now before him, for he is your king. When Merlin finished speaking, a great silence descended upon the plain. The kings were undecided. Some regarded Merlin as a mighty wizard and perceived they were at the beginning of a new and wonderful era. Others, like King Lot, laughed him to scorn. The first went over with their armies to King Arthur. The second renewed the siege. But now King Arthur was the stronger. Not only did he have a vast army under his command, but the people of Corleone came to his support with sticks and pitchforks, and after a fierce battle, of Arthur's enemies only King Lot and King Cardos remained alive, fleeing with their surviving knights. When the great battle was over, all the kings present with one voice proclaimed Arthur king, promising their loyalty and obedience. And all those present cheered and cheered, for they knew that this was the true beginning of King Arthur's reign. And many of knights knelt before Arthur. This is a picture of Arthur knighting Grifflet on both of his shoulders. The knighting process, the king would take a sword and place it on both sides and swear the noblemen into his service.
But
and that's how they would become a knight.
Have a king.
Well, Arthur became king. At the time, a bunch of small little places, different places had their own kings, like Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, Canterbury. They were all their own little kingdoms because after Uther Pendragon died, there was no longer one king. So it was a bunch of people who were trying to be king. Does that make sense? All right. So shall we read the next story? I think
We can do another one tomorrow.
Well, we'll do this one. This one is Excalibur. So, this next story is the story of Excalibur.
Then we'll probably stop and do another one tomorrow.
Yep. One day, a young page rode into King Arthur's castle at Camelot, leading a white horse on which lay the broken body of a knight. "My good master has been slain by a knight in the forest," he told the king. "We were riding along a forest track when we came upon a shield suspended from a tree, and on that shield were inscribed these words: 'Whoever passes this way does so at his peril.'" Now my master, Sir Miles, went straight to the tent beyond and challenged the unknown knight. A fierce battle ensued, and my master was dealt a mortal wound. Is there a man here brave enough to avenge his death? The knights at King Arthur's court muttered angrily amongst themselves at this foul deed, for the forest should be open and free to all travelers. A young squire, Griflet, at once stepped forward. Make me a knight, I beg of you, he appealed to Arthur, so that I may ride forth and challenge this unjust knight who bars the way to honest men. King Arthur hesitated, for Griflet was too young for the noble deeds of knighthood, and Merlin at his side said gruffly, It would be a pity to lose such a bold young man, for he would make a noble knight one day. That knight in the forest is Sir Pellinore, one of the strongest men of arms in all the realm. Arthur stood silent, at last angry at Sir Miles' death and moved by the young squire's pleas. Arthur took his sword and touched Griflet on both shoulders. Arise, Sir Griflet, Arthur said, but you must promise me on your honor as a newly made knight that you will return forthwith after jousting with Sir Pellinore. The bold Sir Griflet gladly took up a lance and shield, mounted his horse, and galloped off to fulfill his mission. It was not long before he came to the shield hanging from a tree. He struck it so hard that it came crashing down with a terrible clatter.
So did he try to pull out the sword?
No. The sword is now held by King Arthur.
Before he pulled out
No.
the sword.
No, this story takes place after Arthur was already became king. Because if he wasn't king, he couldn't knight Griflet. Right. So, straight away, a huge fellow came rushing out of his tent among the trees. Who dares strike my shield? He roared. It is I, said Griflet. I come to challenge you. Seeing the callow youth before him, the huge knight hung back, knowing the battle would be uneven. I have no wish to fight you, sir, he said. You are too young and inexperienced. Then you are a coward, Sir Griflet cried. Stung by the lad's bold taunts, Sir Pellinore mounted his horse and rode full tilt towards his challenger, his lance at the ready. Sir Griflet did the same. Both lances hit their mark, but while Pellinore's shield was merely dented, his own lance smashed through Griflet's shield and deep into the lad's left side, knocking him to the ground. So deep was the wound that Pellinore's lance broke, and the shaft remained embedded in Griflet's side. Bending over the youth and removing his helmet so that he might breathe more freely, Pellinore said, You have more courage than good sense, and should you survive my blow, you will one day be a famous knight. Then he set the young knight on his horse and slapped its flanks, sending it racing off along the forest path, back to King Arthur's court. Then he set the young knight... Oh, I already read that. The knights groaned when they saw the blood-stained body of Sir Griflet borne into the courtyard. His wounds were quickly dressed, and the lance head and shaft cut free, and leeches were applied to his bruises to suck out the bad blood. But it was to be many months before Sir Griflet recovered.
So he died, like he's...
No, he didn't die. He almost died. The lance, when it hit him, it went through the shield, hit him in the side, and broke in him. It was still in him. So the knight picked him up, put him over the back of the horse, and sent the horse back to King Arthur.
So
When he got there, they treated him. They gave him medical care, right? But at the time, they had to use leeches. So they stuck leeches on all the bruises where, think of it like where he was hurt. There's also a lot of blood blisters, right? So there was blood trapped under the skin. And if it's left there, it could cause infection, lead to blood poisoning and stuff like that. So they would attach leeches to get rid of that blood. Or at least that was the theory. Thankfully, we don't have to rely on that nowadays. And it took him several months before he recovered from the injury. So angry was King Arthur when he saw the wounded knight that straight away he buckled on his own armor, snapped shut the visor of his helmet so that he would not be recognized, and rode off swiftly into the forest. In no time at all he came upon Sir Pellinore sitting calmly beside his tent. "Sir Knight," said Arthur, "why do you bar the way of honest wayfarers? I ask you now to step aside." "I do as I please," Pellinore replied. "If you wish to pass, you must fight me first." "Then I shall do just that," said Arthur grimly. The two men drew apart, then came together, riding so fiercely that both their lances broke in two. In an instant they had leapt down from their steeds and lunged forward with their swords. The mighty blows rang around the glade as they hacked and hewed at one another. Several blows ripped through the leather thongs that bound their armor, so that their skin... Okay.
Bye, Ducky. Bye, Nemo.
Say goodnight.
Good night.
Good night.
Love you, Ducky.
The mighty blows rang around the glade as they hacked and hewed at one another. Several blows ripped through the leather thongs that bound their armor, so that their skin was pierced and the red blood ran down freely, staining the trampled earth. For a long time they mashed each other blow for blow, until Arthur aimed such a mighty stroke that his sword broke clean in two, leaving him defenseless. With a triumphant cry, the huge knight threw himself at Arthur and knocked him to the ground, tearing off Arthur's helmet. He raised his sword and cried, "Now you will yield to me, or I shall cut off your head." "I yield to no man," shouted Arthur. "As for death, I welcome it when it comes." "Then prepare to meet it now," roared Pellinore, raising his sword high. He would indeed have cut off Arthur's head had not Merlin intervened. Appearing before the startled Pellinore, he grasped his sword arm to prevent the blow and said, "Bold knight, stay your hand. Should you kill this man, you would put out the light of hope for this entire realm. This is King Arthur." For a moment, Pellinore was tempted to strike the fatal blow, afraid that Arthur would never pardon him for what he had done. But Merlin placed 2 fingers on Pellinore's forehead, and instantly he fell into a deep slumber. Then Merlin helped the sorely wounded Arthur onto his horse and led him through the forest. "Alas," said Arthur as they went along, "ye have killed that valiant knight by your magic. Gladly would I have surrendered my life and kingdom rather than to have won a battle thus." "Fear not," said Merlin. "He is in better health than you, and within 3 hours he will awaken from the enchantment. And if it had not been for me, he would have killed you. Henceforth he will serve you well, as too will his son, Sir Percival, and Sir Tor. They will one day be among the bravest of your knights." Merlin led Arthur to an old hermit in the depths of the forest. The man knew of herbs which would heal Arthur's dire wounds, and in 3 days he was well enough to ride on. This is a drawing depicting that when Pellinor tore off Arthur's helmet and was raising to strike the final blow. As Arthur and Merlin took their leave, the king sorry. See, and Merlin took their leave, the king realized he now had no sword with which to defend himself. "It matters not," said Merlin mysteriously, "for we go now to seek a sword unlike any that exists in Christendom." They rode on through the forest for several days until finally they came to a broad blue lake. As Arthur stood upon the shore, gazing into the still waters, he suddenly saw a most strange sight. Rising out of the middle of the lake was an arm draped in smooth white silk, holding aloft a shining sword. They rode on through the forest for... "Behold," said Merlin, "there is the sword of which I spoke." Even as they watched, a lovely maiden rose out of the water and came walking lightly across the lake. "Who is she?" whispered Arthur. "That is the Lady of the Lake," answered Merlin. "She dwells beneath the waters within a cave, and there she has a palace as grand and comfortable as any on earth. Be patient. She will tell you how you may possess that sword." While Merlin was speaking, the lovely maiden approached, bowing low before King Arthur. "I am the Lady of the Lake," she said. "I come to tell you that your sword Excalibur awaits you yonder. For long I have guarded it for you, waiting for your birth and growth to manhood. But you must make one promise to me. One day, when I come to you and ask for a gift, you will grant me whatever I ask." "You have my word," Arthur said at once. "Then take this boat," she said, "and it will carry you to the center of the lake so that you may take the sword and its scabbard too." Seeing a boat gliding over the water towards him, Arthur stepped into it as it touched the shore, and at once it sailed across the lake as if drawn by unseen hands. When he came alongside the silk-clad arm, Arthur reached out and took the sword and its scabbard. Instantly the arm disappeared below the water with scarcely a ripple. Thereupon the boat turned round all by itself and bore Arthur to the shore where the lovely Lady of the Lake stood. But she too had vanished. Arthur sprang out of the boat and showed Merlin the splendid sword. "Which do you hold more dear, the sharp sword or its scabbard?" asked Merlin. "The sword, of course," said Arthur. "Then more fool you," said Merlin gravely, "for the scabbard is worth 10 such swords. All the while you wear it at your side, you will not shed a single drop of blood, no matter how badly you are wounded. Be sure, therefore, to keep it with you always, and heed my warning. Your half-sister, Queen Morgana Le Fay, will soon try to steal your sword and scabbard and have you slain. For she is a sorceress and desires to reign over Logres herself." Arthur was deeply hurt by Merlin's words, since he loved his sister dearly, and he would not listen to the warning. Of the two men the two men rode to Camelot, and at last arrived there, much to the relief and joy of King Arthur's knights. And when they heard of his adventure, they wondered much at the great sword Excalibur and the story of the Lady of the Lake. On the day following King Arthur's return to Camelot with the sword Excalibur, he went hunting in the forest with two of his bold knights, Sir Accolon of Gaul and King Uriens, husband of his half-sister Queen Morgana le Fay. They rode so hard chasing a great stag that within a short while they had distanced themselves more than 10 miles from Camelot. Not sparing their horses, they raced on and on until the poor beasts fell beneath them, and they had to continue the hunt on foot. Soon the stag was out of sight, and the three hunters regretted their thoughtless actions. They walked until the sun began to set, when they came to a broad flowing river and saw a boat all hung with rich silk beached upon the sands. Summoning his two comrades, Arthur led them up to the vessel, and they called loudly, but no one answered. The boat was silent and deserted. The three men sat wearily on the bank. Then, as the dusk of evening fell, 100 torches flared up about the boat, turning night to day, and 12 fair damsels appeared and knelt before King Arthur, calling him by name and welcoming him on board. They led him and his two comrades to an ample cabin where rich meats and wines awaited them. Never in their lives had the three men fared so well at table. When they had supped to their contentment, the three knights were taken to separate cabins. Straightway they fell asleep and slumbered soundly throughout the night, and each had strange adventures on the morn. When King Uriens awoke, he found himself in his own bed at Camelot beside his wife, Morgana le Fay. How he came to be there he knew not, since the night before he had been at least 2 days' journeys from Camelot. But knowing his wife to be a great sorceress, he kept quiet from fear. When King Arthur awoke, he found himself in a dark dungeon all alone. Presently a damsel came to him and told him this. "Sir, you will remain here captive all your life unless you do this castle lord a service. You must fight a warrior knight on his behalf." "That gives me little choice," said Arthur. "I would prefer to do battle with a knight than die in prison. Tell your lord I will fight on his behalf, though I do so against my will." Then, looking hard at the maiden, Arthur felt he recognized her face. "Seems to me, damsel," he said, "that I have seen you at my court." "No," the maiden said, "I have never been there. I am daughter to the lord of this castle." But she spoke falsely, for in truth she was in service of Morgana le Fay, and was about her bidding. In the meantime, the third knight, Accolon of Gaul, awoke by a well side in the castle grounds to find a dwarf standing over him. "Sir," said the dwarf, "I come now from Queen Morgana le Fay. My lady greets you, and bids you be of stout heart, for she asks you to defend her honor in battle with the warrior knight, and she sends you Excalibur, King Arthur's sword, and its scabbard. Even as you love her, she orders you to do battle to the death, showing no mercy to the evil knight. When you bring her the knight's head upon a platter, she will make you her husband, and you will be king." Now, it was true that Sir Accolon deeply loved Queen Morgana, and had vowed to serve her faithfully. He knew by the shining presence of Excalibur that the dwarf was speaking truly, and that all the enchantments had been Morgana's doing. So at last he said, "Recommend me to my lady queen, and tell her all shall be done as she desires." The dwarf led Accolon to a waiting horse and helped him don a suit of armor. Then Accolon rode forthwith to the jousting field where Arthur, similarly suited with the visor down and bearing a shield with no emblem, was waiting. Just before the hour of battle, a maiden had come to Arthur bearing a sword exactly like Excalibur, telling him, "Your sister, Queen Morgana, hearing of your plight, sends you your sword and scabbard for her great love of you." Upon the jousting meadow, the two knights stood at opposite sides, then let their horses run so fast that each struck with his lance full square upon the other's shield. Both steed and men crashed to the ground, but the knights were quickly on their feet, swords drawn. Eagerly they traded blow for blow, yet always Arthur's sword failed to bite as Accolon's did. With every stroke that Accolon gave, he sorely wounded Arthur, so that it was marvel he did not fall. When Arthur saw the ground stained red with his lifeblood, and his foe barely scratched, he suspected that he had been tricked, and that Excalibur was in the other knight's hand, not his. "Now, sir," said Accolon to King Arthur, "heed well, for I am going to slay you." The taunt only made Arthur redouble his efforts, and he gave Accolon such a buffeting upon his helmet that he was staggered back and all but fell. But then Accolon suddenly rushed forward. Excalibur held aloft and brought the sword down hard on Arthur's shoulder, so that it almost knocked him to the earth. Both were now as mad as wounded fighting cocks, and dealt each other many heavy blows. Yet Arthur continued to lose so much blood that it was a marvel he did not faint. Only so brave a knight as he could endure the pain. And all who watched the battle vowed they had never seen a knight fight as well as this stranger, nor endured such pain, and all were sorry for him, since they knew that he was bound to die. At last Arthur had to pause for breath, while Accolon taunted him, saying, "Come now, sir, your life is at an end. Unlace your helmet so that I can remove your head." Thereupon Accolon came fiercely at Arthur, but the king put all of his strength into one last blow, which struck Accolon high upon the helmet and knocked him to the ground. However, at that blow, Arthur's sword blade broke and fell to the blood-stained earth, leaving only the hilt and pommel in his hand. Seeing his advantage, Accolon sprang up and prepared to make the final thrust. "Prepare to die, Sir Knight," he cried loudly. "I would rather die with honor than live with shame," said Arthur. "The shame is yours if you would slay me weaponless." "I care not for shame," said Accolon. "I have vowed to do battle to the death." With that he rushed Arthur, but once again Arthur managed to parry the blow on his shield, and gave back with his sword hilt as best he could. Now, while the fight was going on, Merlin mingled with the crowd and saw Arthur's plight. Thus, by enchantment, he caused the scabbard at Accolon's side to fall to the ground, and Accolon went to deal one final blow upon King Arthur. The sword Excalibur twisted from his hand and stuck quivering in the soft earth. In an instant, Arthur leapt forward and snatched it up, knowing at once that it was his sword Excalibur. "You have been away from me too long," he cried, "and much damage have you done me." And addressing Accolon, he said, "Now, sir, you shall know how it is to feel the sharp cuts of Excalibur." With that, he rushed Sir Accolon and gave him such a blow that the blood burst forth from his nose and mouth. So in this picture, you see the dwarf standing over Sir Accolon. Slay me if you must, gasped Accolon, for I will not yield. That I vowed before the battle before I died. Though I will tell you that you are the best knight I have ever met. You are a brave and honorable man, said Arthur, standing back, leaning on his sword. Tell me who you are. I am Accolon of Gaul, from King Arthur's court, the wounded knight replied. Tell me, I pray you, said Arthur dismayed, who it was gave you the sword. Morgana le Fay, King Urion's wife, sent it to me, replied Sir Accolon, that I might slay you with it. She told me you were an evil knight who had reviled her honor. Oh, Accolon, cried King Arthur, it is your king you would have slain. My half-sister Morgana has tricked us both by her false crafts. By my faith, I shall have revenge on her, for I trusted her more than all my kin. As Arthur spoke these words, the poor Sir Accolon breathed his last and fell back dead upon the ground. Forthwith Arthur had his body sent upon a white horse to Camelot in the company of 6 knights. Take him to my sister Morgana le Fay, and say I send him to her as a present, said Arthur grimly. Then at last King Arthur limped from the field of battle, mounted his horse, and rode 3 miles to an abbey of nuns, hoping they could heal his wounds. Meanwhile at Camelot, Morgana le Fay went about her evil designs, believing that she had disposed of Arthur, and would soon be rid of her husband King Uriens too. Imagine her fury when a white charger trotted slowly into Camelot, bearing the limp body of Sir Accolon. It was then she learned the tidings of King Arthur. Outwardly she retained her calm countenance, and made no show of her rage. But at once she began to seek another way of destroying Arthur. Hearing from one of her maids that Arthur was recovering from his wounds at an abbey, Morgana set out early before the sun was up. She rode alone all through the day and night, until at noon the next day she came to the same abbey in the forest where lay King Arthur. To her inquiry as to where he was, the nuns answered that they had put him in a bed to sleep, for he had but little rest these 3 days past. Well then, she said, I charge that none of you wake him now. Since I am his sister, I shall ensure that he is as well as I would have him. So she went straight to his chambers, and there found Arthur asleep in bed. But even in his slumbers, Arthur firmly gripped Excalibur in his hand, lest anyone try to steal it again. As soon as Morgana spied the naked blade in her brother's hand, she feared to take it and wake him up. It was then she saw the scabbard laying on a bedside chair, her eyes gleaming with evil cunning. Quietly lifting it up and concealing it beneath her cloak, she slipped stealthily from the abbey and rode away. When the king awoke and missed his scabbard, he was extremely angry, demanding to know who had been there, and as the nuns told him of his sister's visit, he sighed deeply. Alas, he said, you have betrayed my trust and left me unprotected. But, sir, the nuns pleaded, we dare not disobey your sister. In silence, Arthur rose painfully from his bed, still weak and faint from loss of blood, put on his armor, and rode off after his evil sister. He had not gone far when he came to a parting of the ways where stood a cowherd with his cows. Did you see a lady lately riding by? King Arthur asked the poor man. Sir, the cowherd said. "Just now a lady came riding past and rode into yonder forest." Arthur spurred on his horse, riding hard in his sister's tracks, and within a while he caught sight of her in the distance, and she saw him. A furious chase began through the forest and over plain. When Morgana saw there was no escape, she halted by a lakeside and threw the scabbard far into the deepest water, crying, "Whatever becomes of me, my brother shall not have this scabbard!" And the scabbard of Excalibur, being heavy with gold and precious stones, sank to the bottom of the lake. Then, urging on her horse, Morgana rode into a rocky valley and turned herself by magic into a great marble stone, horse and rider alike. Thus, when King Arthur rode up a few minutes later, he could find no trace of either Morgana or her horse. After searching long and hard both for his sister and the scabbard, Arthur finally gave up and turned for Camelot. And there his barons were relieved to see him, astounded at his adventures, and all were filled with fury at the falsehood of Queen Morgana. Many knights demanded that she be burned. But Morgana le Fay was not yet defeated. As soon as King Arthur had ridden out of sight, she resumed her human form and rode off to join her party of knights and maidens who awaited her in the forest glade. I lost where I was. And from there she dispatched a maiden to King Arthur at Camelot with a splendid cloak set with precious gems, the richest garments ever seen. When this maiden came to court, she repeated her mistress's words, "King Arthur, your sister sends you this cloak as gift, and token of her repentance for the harm she has done you. She is deeply sorry and desires you to accept her present. Soon she will be here herself to take whatever punishment you deem worthy." When the king beheld the cloak, it pleased him greatly, and he longed to try it on. But just as he went to take it, Merlin touched his arm and drew him aside, whispering in his ear, "Do not don this cloak until Morgana's maid has tried it first." So King Arthur told the envoy, "Damoiseau, I wish you to try on the cloak before I wear it." "Oh no," she said in alarm. "It would not become me to wear a royal garment." "You will obey my command," said Arthur, "and you will wear the cloak before it is on my back or any other's." And so the king had the cloak put upon her. At once a sheet of flames flared up, and she shriveled to a heap of smoldering ashes. When Morgana le Fay heard these tidings, she left at once for her own castle in the lands of Gore, and never again entered the realm of Logres. Alright, and that is the end of the story of Excalibur. We will continue on reading a couple of others, and once we finish this book with the stories of King Arthur, we shall move on to something else. Alright, so once again, I was reading from The Tales of King Arthor by James Riordan. I'm liking it, and I'm realizing how much of the original story of King Arthur I've forgotten. That being said, I hope you enjoyed the book. I love you, Dahi. Nia Moore, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're enjoying these videos. As for anyone else who's been watching, thank you. I hope you've been enjoying the stories as well. Feel free to let me know how I'm doing, or any suggestions you might have for any books I might read in the future. Thank you again. Love you, Dahi, and can't wait till I'm back at your side.